how do we deal with the American free enterprise system as it's actually constituted and instituted today? Because all reforms take place starting from the status quo. So the question is, starting from where we are right now, can the distributists offer us anything valuable from the perspective of reform? And I think that the answer is yes.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Tom Saruf. And joining us today is Alexander Salter, who is the Georgie G. Snyder Associate Professor of Economics in the Rawls College of Business at Texas Tech University, the Comparative Economics Research Fellow at TTU's Free Market Institute, and an Associate Editor of the Journal of Private Enterprise. Additionally, he is a Sound Money Project Senior Fellow and a Young Voices Senior Contributor. His first book, Money and the Rule of Law, Generality and Predictability in Monetary Institutions, is published with Cambridge University Press in May of 2021. And his most recent book, which will be out by the time this podcast is released, is The Political Economy of Distributism, Property, Liberty, and the Common Good, published by Catholic University of America Press, which is the subject of this episode. So welcome to the podcast, Dr. Salter. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you, Tom. It's great to be here.
And before we continue with our interview, I'd like to thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and our mission is educating for liberty. If you'd like to join us in fulfilling this mission, be sure to rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts to help us reach more listeners like yourself. Well, Dr. Salter, congratulations on the new book. And I didn't read the entire thing, but I read large sections of it to prepare for the interview because I like to consider myself an economics buff. I did a senior undergraduate philosophy thesis on the anthropology of different political economy, specifically some of the issues popping up in the new right on questions of free trade and national interest related to economic policy. But I must admit to you, I am woefully undereducated on the distributist angle or the distributist discourse within economic history and economic theory. So it was a great to get me up to speed on some of the major issues. And it is timely because you do a great job tying it in with discussions over common good capitalism and sort of the disaffection that a lot of Americans feel with the political and economic regime. So maybe you can just start off by telling us, what is distributism exactly, and how does it fit into some of the discussions that are going on today?
Sure. So distributism is the name that typically applies to an early 20th century socio-political system, a political economic system thought up by thinkers like Hilaire, Belloc, and G.K. Chesterton, who are looking to explicitly build a political economic philosophy for how social institutions were supposed to work on the lines of Catholic social teaching. So I think that that's the line of continuity there. Beginning in the late 19th century, you have various papal encyclicals and other church documents that start to promulgate what's called the social question in Catholic social teaching, the change duties of labor and capital, how to approach the Industrial Revolution, the moral issues that arise out of the changed nature of how goods and services are produced and distributed on a wide scale. And so what Chesterton, Belloc, and some of their compatriots tried to do was figure out, in light of these social changes and in light of the ethical requirements of Catholic social teaching, how can political and economic institutions be structured so as to support the common good? And that's where I really think distributism comes from. And the novel thing about distributism, looking at that time period, was its emphasis on the importance of private property, not just in the positive free market sense that we think about it today, but also in the sense of cultivating political liberty, this idea that private property affords political independence and is conducive to a self-governing people. This is a theme that will be familiar to many Americans in the American tradition of political economy. It's a very Jeffersonian theme. So it's not like Belloc and Chesterton, although they were Englishmen, we're talking about themes that are foreign to the American experience. So there's a lot there to dig into for those of us who come from the other side of the pond.
Definitely. And sort of also thinking contemporarily, there's sort of a move for common good capitalism. There's the famous Marco Rubio speech at Catholic University, and you mentioned that at the beginning in the intro to your book. How is distributism substantively different than, I guess, just regular capitalism, or the capitalism maybe the way the founders thought of it, and then also socialism, and then sort of this sort of new, maybe not middle, I don't know if common good capitalism would be a middle position between the two, or if distributism could be considered a middle ground between socialism on the one hand and capitalism on the other. How does it fit within other systems that are probably very familiar to a lot of our students and listeners?
That's a great question. So I did motivate the book by talking about the contemporary public conversation around common good capitalism. You brought up the Marco Rubio speech that he gave at Catholic University of America's Bush School of Business. I believe that was fall 2019. You since have many other intellectual and public/political voices on the American right who seek to reorient free enterprise towards the common good. If that's your goal, presupposed in that is the claim that free enterprise right now is not oriented towards the common good. There must be some divergence, probably not in totality, but at least at the margin, right, in certain key respects, that the ordinary operation of the American economic system does not actually contribute to the well-being of authentic human communities as communities. So if that's what you think, obviously you're going to look for policy reforms that can help bring those things back into realignment. And what I say in the book is distributism is a neglected branch of thought that offers an answer to that question. Although these conversations were taking place 100 years beforehand, they nonetheless were wrestling with many of the same themes. So I do not claim in the book that distributism is the only way of achieving common good capitalism or of reorienting free enterprise towards the common good. It is a way of thinking about the problem, and I think that the unique insights it offers about the nature of decentralized and widely dispersed private property can help us approach questions of public import in a unique way. Now, I want to add a disclaimer. I wrote this book because I found the distributists fascinating, and I wanted to get their message out there. But I am much more optimistic about old-fashioned free enterprise than are the distributists. I myself am a classical liberal. Sometimes I describe myself as a libertarian. I'm a free markets guy. Many of the people that I'm writing about are not. And I think that that's okay, because I think that this is a view that can contribute to this ongoing conversation. And I want to make sure that those views are represented so we can do justice and charity to all sides when we're asking the questions, how do we deal with the American free enterprise system as it's actually constituted and instituted today? Because all reforms take place starting from the status quo. So the question is, starting from where we are right now, can the distributists offer us anything valuable from the perspective of reform? And I think that the answer is yes.
Fair enough. And I think, when I was reading sections of the book, your analysis of Belloc and of Chesterton, I thought you did a great job, very fair, even if you yourself might be skeptical of some of the things, or maybe some of the approach that distributism takes. I thought you did a really good job explaining and making it clear to someone who doesn't know anything about where they're coming from and what they're driving home at. Let me ask though, do you need to be Catholic in order to be a distributist, or rather, can the principles of distributism be discerned apart from or outside of Catholic social teaching? Could you arrive just at reason alone instead of reason perfected by revelation, which I think is how the Catholic position, how Catholics, I'm Catholic, would think of that. That reason and revelation go together, but revelation perfects natural reason, though certainly never contradicts it. So, but can you arrive at that just by pure reason alone, or do you need this sort of Catholic worldview to get to distributism?
I'm not sure that pure reason alone will get you there, if by that we mean the natural law, the body of natural principles of justice that all reasonable people are supposed to be able to intuit, as Scripture and the pagan tradition teaches us. But at the same time, I don't think that you need to be Catholic in order to appreciate the value of the distributist worldview. I think the phrase that I use in the book is that distributism is explicitly Catholic, but it is not specific, it's not uniquely Catholic, in the sense that the Catholic way of thinking about social questions does animate distributism, but you can also come from other faith traditions or even no faith traditions, so long as you think about the needs of authentic human communities in a way that simultaneously gets you to the nexus of the interactions between political and economic systems. So one of the thinkers that I talk about in the book who explicitly built on the distributists was a political economist named Wilhelm Röpke, a post-World War II, Swiss-born German economist. Röpke was a Protestant, but he highly valued the common good. He highly valued Catholic social teaching, and he thought it was useful for his own enterprise, his own project of rediscovering what he called a humane economy. And so while I definitely think men and women of faith, especially in the Judeo-Christian tradition, will have an easier time with these principles, No, I do not think that you have to be specifically Catholic to appreciate this, or that it's only relevant for Catholics. You can come from various Protestant traditions. I myself am Eastern Orthodox, and there are other faiths outside of Christianity that I also think can meaningfully take these principles and put them to work in a good way.
Well, that's very interesting. If you don't want to talk about your Eastern Orthodox faith, then by all means, we'll move on. But I'm wondering, there's a Catholic social teaching. I'd imagine the Orthodox faith. I'm Eastern Catholic, so I sort of similar maybe emphasis or themes within the theology. But what is the Eastern Orthodox social teaching, and what do they teach about economics, markets, and the common good?
That is actually a complicated question to answer. So, in the Eastern Orthodox Church, there is no compendium of social teaching, no magisterium. These are institutions that we just don't have. So if you want to understand the Orthodox mind on these questions, you have to go back to Scripture, you have to go to the Church Fathers. They are there, but they're scattered. The Church has never really felt a need to compile these things into a single source or small group of sources. So the reading that you have to do and the thinking that you have to do is much more widespread. Again, I don't want to give the impression that the Eastern Orthodox churches have never considered these questions. They absolutely have. But by the nature of the Eastern Church's ecclesiology, it's comparatively more, decentralized is the wrong word, but I can't think of a better one, so I'll use decentralized. Because of that, there's no one-stop shop, so to speak, where you can go to for references of these things. Combine that with the Eastern Church's comparative reluctance to do things like dogmatizing teachings that are not truly essential for the faith. You have a harder time figuring out exactly what the contours of the Eastern Orthodox social teaching, economic teachings are. Again, they're there. They're definitely there in St. John Chrysostom. They're definitely there in St. Maximus the Confessor. You can find these things, but it's going to be much more of a work of reconstruction. I don't have a catechism that I can open and pop to the section on economic justice or political justice to answer these questions. And that's neither a feature nor a bug. It's just a property of the differing nature of how these two churches and faith traditions are constituted, I think. Fair enough.
I mean, for me, even though I'm Eastern Catholic, most of my education was in the Western Catholic tradition. I went to like Latin Rite schools for my entire education. So
but you do get the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom on Sundays.
That's right. Amen. Let me ask you then, as an economist, returning then to the economics of distributism. One of the things you said in the introduction and throughout the book is that Belloc and Chesterton get a number of things wrong from the perspective of economic science, but nevertheless, their larger social point or social critique is still relevant. And I think part of that has maybe been intimated already beforehand in some of what you've said already, in that distributism is a way of looking at how can the common good be explicitly infused into capitalism. We're using capitalism to specifically achieve the common good. Or that's one way of doing it. I guess thinking about the idea of like a political economy as opposed to just economics by itself, just looking at the bigger picture of economics, is that what you need to do in order to, I guess, keep Belloc and Chesterton in the tradition? Or do they still have some economic, I guess from an economic science perspective, are they still carrying some water even if they're getting some things wrong?
The distinction that I use in the book is the science of economics versus the art of political economy. And I think that concisely captures the difference between the two. This is going to be contentious to many of your listeners, but I truly, strongly believe that there is such a thing as the science of economics. There is a pure science of means and ends. We can arrive at scientific knowledge of how markets work. There are right and wrong answers to questions pertaining to the relationship between prices, incomes, the distribution of income, for example. So on those issues, Belloc was okay, but he did make some elementary errors, and Chesterton is just all over the place. And many times he's just not even on the map. So in terms of what we know, in terms of the basics of how markets work, yeah, there's a lot of what Chesterton and Belloc are saying that simply does not hold water. And so I wouldn't turn to them if you want to actually undertake serious study of economics. But I'm equally emphatic in the book that their scientific errors do not invalidate the importance of their political economic art. Why does anyone do economics? Well, on the one hand, we have a disinterested desire to know how the world works, and that desire to experience and understand the wonder of human society impels us to investigate it. That's great. But most people also go into economics because they want to make the world a better place in some way. Just like the reason that most people go into medicine, even though medicine is a science, is to heal people. That's an ethical goal. That's a normative goal. And so we learn the science of economics to apply it to the art of political economy, which in the American Republic I interpret as an ongoing conversation about how we govern ourselves. You cannot reduce that to mere science. Any question about what should be done publicly, public policy, institutions, all that stuff ultimately comes down to value judgments. And so you have to incorporate an explicitly ethical perspective to these questions. The science of economics is necessary for good political economy, but it is not sufficient. And it's when you broaden your horizon to incorporate these normative concerns, these ethical concerns, that distributists really shine. Because they are capturing something that I think that economics as a discipline, not just a science, but as a scholarly enterprise has missed. Their way of thinking about property is, I think, original and valuable, and it needs to be having a much more prominent role, especially in the literature and economics that we talk about today called comparative institutional analysis. It's just basically a fancy way of studying how different rules of the social game, so to speak, create certain outcomes and discourage others. So I would think the right thing to do with the distributist is get your scientific economics from the textbook. Don't listen to anything they say about efficiency, though. They're confused about that. But in terms of demand curve slope down and everything that proceeds from that, the inverse relationship between the price of a good and the amount of it people buy, that's the core of it. Take that from the textbooks. But in terms of your broader ethical concerns, yeah, the distributists should be on your reading list and they should not be neglected.
And when you say efficiency, don't listen to them on efficiency, is that because efficiency for them is sort of like the normative lodestar? We have to do everything to increase efficiency at any other cost? Or is there some other reason that traditional economics textbooks get confused about efficiency?
So there's nothing wrong with efficiency as most economists define it. Usually the definition that you'll find in a textbook is the efficient distribution of resources is one that maximizes the value of society's property rights, right? So if I have an apple and I'm auctioning it off, the efficient solution is for me to give it to the person who's willing to pay the most. If I don't give it to the person who's willing to pay the most, as long as they're still able to trade with each other, the apple is going to end up with the person who values it most in dollar terms, because they can engage in side bargains, side deals, right? So the apple going to the person who values it the most, that's efficient. Apply that to every good or service, that's efficiency. That's a perfectly legitimate social scientific concept in terms of analyzing how markets do work, figuring out what forces actually do drive the distribution of society's property rights. My problem with many, but not all economists, is that they sometimes slip between describing efficiency in a descriptive or positive sense and a normative or ethical sense. Many economists don't seem to realize that, hey, public policies should have the goal of efficiency. That's an ethical claim. It may be correct, it may not be correct, but it is a normative claim, and it is not reducible to value-free social science. And so when you make that move, you're actually committing, I would argue, violence not only to economic science, but also a humane political philosophy and a humane social philosophy. You have to realize the difference between statements of is and statements of ought. I'm not saying value judgments are not real, right? I'm not a positivist. I don't think that ethics is somehow fake. I'm just saying that however we think of the ultimate status of the positive normative distinction, right? The relationship between statements of is and statements of ought, they do describe different, although intersecting spheres of reality. And so the way that I like to think of it is that as a science, economics can only properly speak to the first of these. That's not segmenting reality, right? We're not embracing a relatively narrow metaphysics. We're just saying, look, economics has competence in one key area of human endeavor. Philosophy, theology, these are also telling us true things. Truth is one thing, right? So it's not like there are different kinds of truth for economics as there are for philosophy. But it's nonetheless the case that these are different segments of reality, and we can and should be humble about the scope of our discipline and the scope of our science.
Sure, that makes sense. And that's just another testament to the importance of interdisciplinary study, or why we'd have political economy versus just the science of economics by itself. But let me ask you about Belloc and Chesterton. We'll go through the thinkers that you analyze at great length in the book. With Belloc in the servile state, maybe you could define what he means by the servile state, or like that we're moving towards a servile state. And how does that take place as he's describing it, within the industrial capitalist society, which is predicated on the idea of freedom of contract. So how does freedom of contract and not non-compelled labor get us to an idea of compelled labor or a servile state?
Mm-hmm. You hit the nail on the head. In Belloc's servile state, the distinguishing feature of labor is that it's no longer free. You basically no longer have the legal right to refuse employment except on terms that you yourself decide. Somebody is going to legally impose their will on you to get you to work in ways that you otherwise would not. Belloc thought that early 20th century industrial England was tending toward the servile state because he thought that the increased concentration in capital in the hands of relatively few property owners was ultimately incompatible with free labor. He thought that basically something had to give. Either it was the case that you had to decentralize the concentration of property and restore genuine free enterprise, or it had to be the case that the government was going to step in and actually direct lines of labor apart from the will of the laborers themselves. Now, as it turns out, Belloc did not get this prediction right. There was never anything like compulsory labor in 20th century England in any meaningful sense of the term. So he got the main prediction associated with this book wrong. Does that mean we shouldn't read the book? I don't think so. I think that there's a lot still in the book that's good and valuable. He has a fascinating narrative economic history in terms of the development of the aristocracy, what he would call the oligarchy in England. His analysis of the rise of capitalism, even if it's wrong in fascinating ways that suggest new avenues for human inquiry. And ultimately, the emphasis that he places on private property being widely dispersed and easily available, I think does tell us something important about free enterprise. Namely that provided that you actually have significant concentrations of property, provided you also have laws on the books that promote monopolization, then you have a huge problem if you care about a free enterprise economy. Belloc understands that crony capitalism is very much a real thing. He understands that what he's observing, what he's writing about, is not just the natural tendencies of markets. He does think that there is a natural concentrative tendency of markets, right? Markets on their own will concentrate property in fewer and fewer hands. I don't personally agree with him on that. But he also recognizes that the political system is being rigged by political elites and market elites, well, I should say corporate elites, at the same time to make this process go faster and harder than it otherwise would. And so Belloc, in writing this book, is saying you can't have both of these things. You can't have meaningful free enterprise at the same time you have this cronyist system. So unless you're willing to embrace a system of compelled labor, you have to choose. He was wrong about the dilemma, but he was right in terms of a basic political economic vision, I think.
Sure. Let's hone in on sort of the cronyism, because he seems to have, by comparison, a much more rosy view of like feudalism or like pre-capitalist England. And so he in the book you describe, or I guess you analyze how he describes like serfdom versus, under feudal lords versus the modern industrial proletariat. What actually is the difference as he sees it, and then maybe as how you see it, given that his prediction hasn't yet come to fruition?
Right. Belloc definitely has some unusual views on this. So he actually analyzes the rise of what we would now call free labor, or the free yeomanry, as they called it in early 20th century England, from an initial state of slavery in the late Roman Empire. Slavery eventually gives rise to serfdom. Serfdom eventually gives rise to free labor through a process by which labor increasingly acquires additional political rights because of their economic power. When the Roman Empire was a going concern and Roman elites lived on villas, economic production units out in the countryside away from major urban areas, you could have a slave system because you could always count on the Roman army to come over the hill and put down a slave revolt. But what happens when the Roman army falls? Suddenly you don't have the Roman army at your back to actually put down your slave revolt if you have one. So if you're a old scion of an aristocratic Roman family, but the Roman Empire is no longer a meaningful going concern, what do you have to do? You got to give your workers a better deal. As that process unfolds, slavery becomes serfdom. Serfdom eventually becomes the free yeomanry, and the free yeomanry eventually becomes the proletariat. Belloc regards part of this bargaining process as desirable and the last part of the bargaining process undesirable because it entails a loss of security on the part of workers. So the way that I like to think about it is Belloc is telling a story about property rights. What actual rights enforceable by whatever legal system you happen to live under are associated with the labor contract? Yes, under serfdom, both in the before the turn of the 11th century and also in the High Middle Ages, it was some form of compelled labor, right? You were attached to the land. But you also had rights against the lord that you worked for. You also had mandated holidays. You couldn't be kicked off your land. You were entitled to a share of your produce. What differentiates that now from what Belloc calls free workers or the proletariat is that there's no more downside protection. So he basically sees the stripping of workers' property rights to an essential means of security as a degradation of the labor market. This is, I want to emphasize again, a very unusual story. Many economic historians would read this and go, what is this guy talking about? But again, the way to read Belloc on this is not to say, yep, we got to go back to the High Middle Ages and the guild system. No, that's not what we want to do. What we should be looking at is his analysis of the labor contract as a social scientific mechanism for aligning the interests of workers with the interests of owners of capital and land and other natural resources. And insofar as there is a divergence, that not only poses questions in terms of, well, how do we get the incentives right for work? It also poses questions of, well, how do we make sure that we have everything that we need to instill and create responsible citizens? Right? We have to think about citizenship. We have to think about civic value. We have to think about ordinary people and ordinary families and whether they have a meaningful stake in the social order. If they don't, why should we be surprised that starting in the middle of the 20th century and perhaps even earlier than that, Western political and economic institutions have become increasingly less free? We shouldn't be surprised by that if freedom and independence are correlative, if only independent people support freedom and free people desire independence. It's a bidirectional feedback loop.
Okay, that's actually, I think, a great segue to move to Chesterton, because one of the claims he makes is that a distributist society is more democratic than a capitalist society, perhaps because it allows more people to have a meaningful stake in their communities by being independent in the way that you've just described. And so we've had other people who have come on the podcast, and they've sort of made the point that capitalism and democracy, it's not an accident that those things rise together at the same time, not only in the United States and in Western Europe, but now sort of throughout the world with the regime of global free trade. So from Chesterton's point of view, from your point of view, we'd love for you to chime in on on that point, and so maybe why it might be different than what other guests have said.
I think the insight there is that economists, social scientists, political scientists, we understand pretty well the idea that political power can create economic power. You can use the political process either to generally enforce property rights and uphold the rule of law, or you can use it to attenuate property rights, enrich cronies at the expense of the public, do things like that. Chesterton is really interesting because he gets at that relationship in reverse. Economic power could be a prerequisite to political power. And that's also similar to the story that Belloc was telling. If you can no longer coercively enforce dominated labor, labor has become de facto economically more powerful, and so they can demand and get more legal rights. Chesterton picks up on that theme and argues that when you actually do have economic decentralization in the form of widely dispersed private property rights, you cannot have or get anything like an oligarchic class arise that controls the agenda in society's political institutions. If your vision of democracy is like Rousseau, a handful of Swiss peasants debating important public issues around a tree, if that's a vision that appeals to you, then decentralized property rights should be something that go along with that. We're not abolishing private property. That's socialism. That's just one form of tyranny. Nor are we allowing the economic elites to dictate the structure of property rights. That's just crony capitalism. So by structuring the rules of the game to keep property dispersed and widely available to all, and it's worth remembering that in Chesterton and Belloc's day, productive property meant not just or even mainly financial instruments. It meant actual means of production, land, tools, these sorts of things that are admittedly less relevant in our own day. So we'll have to find a better analogy for the year of our Lord 2023. But for Chesterton, if it's 1920 or so, that's a perfectly valid way of thinking about these questions. So if you actually value small d democracy, if you actually value deliberative decision-making by a concrete community about its own affairs, then widely dispersed property and hence the distributist agenda should be something that appeals to you because they are complementary to each other.
And is for Chesterton, he hates bigness or like big business. Is that because it's like Belloc's analysis? Is it because it's concentrating a lot of power in the hands of a few people and at the expense of everyone else? Or is there something else per se about bigness that is a problem?
Chesterton thinks bigness in all of its form, big business, big government, is inherently stifling of personality, human dignity, and democracy. So he's very clear on this. A lot of the arguments that he makes are just frankly wacko. They don't make any sense based on how we now know markets work. But nonetheless, again, the key is not his critique of business pricing strategies, right? If you pull out your sophomore industrial organization textbook and go, aha, Chesterton is wrong because of what we now know about, what firms do on page 234. Okay, great. But that's not the essence of what he's getting at. He's making an argument about the kinds of enterprises, the kinds of organizations, political, civil, and economic, that are conducive to the maintenance of a free state. And again, I want to emphasize this is not something this is foreign to the American tradition. This gets at the very heart of the earliest debates we had between Hamiltonians and Jeffersonians as to the nature of the Republic. These themes have been with us since day one of the Republic. These themes have been with us since the colonial era. They're not going away. They're still a live issue now. And just because Chesterton was a lousy economic scientist does not mean we can disregard his artful political economy.
Definitely. Let's turn then, just looking at the time, let's turn to Röpke. And I think he's an interesting thinker, in part because he's not Catholic, as you mentioned. And also he has a pretty strong emphasis on like limited government and economic freedom. And I'm sure you'll get into the nuances and correct me on that and in part or explain maybe the fuller picture of that. But how does Röpke fit into distributism with that sort of intro in mind?
Röpke explicitly built on both Catholic social teaching in general and distributism in particular in formulating his political economic system. There's a fun story about him where he was trying to explain to his era's equivalent of a welfare bureaucrat that just merely shuffling around income wasn't actually going to help anybody in the long run, that you needed to actually provide people dignity and access to productive property so they could learn to craft their own plans and craft their own lives. And the bureaucrat replied in a bewildered voice, "Oh my gosh, are you a Catholic?" So people thought that he was Catholic based on the arguments that he was making. He replied, one did not need to be a Catholic to see things this way. So I think that ties in nicely to the point that we made previously about although distributism was influenced by Catholic social teaching, you absolutely do not need to be a Catholic to appreciate these points. I put Röpke at the end of the book because I think that his is a mind that found the right balance between economic science and artful political economy. I don't think that that means that his public policy prescriptions were always correct. I don't think that we should take the policy agenda that he made circa 1916 just lit to today. That's a recipe for getting things very, very wrong. But if you go and read Röpke's scientific economics writing, he was a no-nonsense economist. He brooked no fools in terms of understanding how markets do and do not work. Prices, incomes, distribution of resources, all this bread and butter stuff that we expect people to come away from an elementary economics education knowing. But he wasn't afraid to broaden his concerns in more humanistic directions when he was speaking to the basic organization of society's institutions. Understanding how markets work is great, but we've been debating how to organize society since Socrates was walking around Athens making people angry. And I don't think that economists should think that just because we understand very well how markets work, that we have a privileged insight into the ethical fundamentals of social organization. Röpke was someone who took that humility seriously, who understood the importance of non-market, pre-market institutions, religion, civil society, the family. You couldn't really have order, liberty, and free enterprise without these things. And there might be a tension there insofar as the results of free enterprise might not be conducive to, for example, the maintenance of stable family structures. That's an argument that you frequently hear on the new right today. Again, I myself think that those arguments are frequently overblown. I'm much more optimistic about good old-fashioned free enterprise. But this is the direction the conversations are tending, and I think that as economists, we have a duty to take these concerns seriously and find what is good in them. If we're not willing to be charitable about ideas that with which we disagree, if we're not willing to substantively engage them, what's the point of being an intellectual? The whole point is to have these debates, to find where the common ground is, and figure out how we can actually adjudicate these debates so everybody can at least get half a loaf.
I could see someone on maybe on the new right, whether they're in favor of distributism just point blank, or maybe they're just a critic of like economic liberalism, or the dead consensus is coming to mind. That's a term bandied about on the new right frequently. But that your book,
I myself love the phrase. I love the phrase zombie Reaganism.
Zombie Reaganism. Okay.
I am an unashamed zombie Reaganite.
Okay, there you go. Well, I could see someone who is not a zombie Reaganite who would see that including Röpke in the book is maybe just a way of sneaking zombie Reaganism or the dead consensus back into under the guise or under the pretense of distributism, or like more common good capitalist thinking, or that it's a move to like co-opt the political moment to maintain the status quo or something. What would you say in response to that? Or you've sort of alluded already to why Röpke is worth considering, or considering anew. He is, I think, underrated, or he's not talked about as much as Friedman. Or
I certainly would like him to be talked about not much more than he is. It's important to remember that he actually had significant prominence as an applied policy economist. He was one of the architects of the post-World War II German social market economy. Right? We all know about, many of us know about the Wirtschaftswunder, the reconstruction rapidly of Germany's economy following the Second World War, the rapid economic growth, rise in living standards. That's a phenomenal achievement. And insofar as Röpke was responsible for that, we should give him a lot more credit and have him weigh in a lot more on current policy debates. Again, not in the sense of exactly enacting his policy descriptions, but in the way he thought about these questions. So to answer yours, I definitely do not think that I am trying to stack the deck against common good capitalism or the movement of the new right. What concerns me is that in these conversations, which are necessarily one part hard-nosed economics and one part more humane ethical vision, that we get the economics right while also respecting the ethical vision in its proper sphere. So my problem with the way that the debates are unfolding is that people are frequently saying things about the way that markets can work or have worked that economic science just shows to be untrue. You cannot ignore economics when having these conversations, but at the same time, economics cannot have by itself the last word. Because again, economics is a value-free science in the sense that what we're talking about is not ethics. We're talking about what markets do or do not do. But all public policy decisions are necessarily moral decisions. So you need good economics to do good political economy, but it's never going to be sufficient by itself. I put Röpke in there because it's all well and good to say you need to do both of these well. It'd be a lot easier if we had an example of somebody who did do it well. Röpke is the example. Right, he's the proof by universal instantiation, I guess you could say. Right, he's my one white raven that disproves the claim that all ravens are black. And insofar as that when he did his applied work, again, he built the German social market economy. It wasn't just laissez-faire that he contributed to after the Second World War. He contributed to German social democracy, redistribution systems, right? Mechanisms for government to police monopolies and maintain competition. You can accuse Röpke of many things, but quote-unquote free market fundamentalism is not one of them. So insofar as we actually have to advance this conversation by getting both parts right, the hard-nosed economics and the artful political economy, Röpke shows us how we can do that. Because again, if we make mistakes in the economics, our policies are going to be wrong. But the policies themselves cannot solely be based on economics because economics by itself is means ends reasoning. Economics can tell you if your goal is Y, you should do X. But I can't tell me whether Y is worth doing or not. So that's why we need to have the ethical considerations in there too.
Okay. Well, we are coming towards the end of our time, but I want to ask one more question. This is sort of like an anthropology question, because at the heart of the distributist thinking, maybe not at the heart of it, but one of the central sort of pieces of understanding is that property or independence that's based upon sort of a minimum material set of conditions that allows one to be independent and self-sufficient in a limited sense, but leads to liberty. And so that's very like Jeffersonian. That would probably be familiar to a lot of our listeners, but there's also a sense in which a number of other founders sort of see this as opposite. I think of Madison's line that, and as much as we find a right to property, we also find a property in our rights. And I think Lincoln probably comes closer to the idea of like free labor, freedom of contract. I don't know whether absolutist is the right term or not, is sort of besides the point, but the idea that our capacities, our talents, the fact that we own our own labor, regardless of whether or not we actually have land, if we're a worker, then, that's enough for achieving, the good news of capitalism or achieving economic mobility. And so it strikes me that there's a sort of a juxtaposition of visions. And so I'd love for you to chime in on that on the one hand, but the other sort of question is that, like, what would need to be done in America to sort of maybe retip the scales, in your view, on this sort of anthropological question? Like, how do we need to view the property liberty, I guess what's preeminent, and what should we be focusing on for today?
Definitely. That's the $1 million question. And so you really have to get at a basic level. You have to really roll up your sleeves and try and figure out what exactly is the relationship between property and liberty. Is it only the case that you need negative rights enforced and then you can just have broad-based economic freedom? I like that view. I want it to be true. It immediately impels the question of why has U.S. economic freedom monotonically declined for so long? Why has the United States government lost the preeminence? Why has the legislature, the deliberative branch, the first among equals, lost its prominence in the national conversation, and the executive and the judiciary is doing pretty much everything these days? I think that if you're going to engage these kinds of constitutional questions, you have to confront head on what the basic foundations of the social order are. And if we actually care about small d democracy conceived of as deliberation, government by discussion, right, rather than outsourcing everything to experts or bureaucrats or something like that, you have to take seriously the idea that the kinds of citizens and the kind of citizenship that kind of a social order requires needs people in that social system to have some way of saying no to the vicissitudes of the market. In the sense that if everything is always up for grabs, you're not going to be secure enough to exercise the kinds of citizenship that are necessary to the maintenance of a free state. This is a hypothesis. This is not something that's proved. This is something that I'm wrestling with in the book because it uncovers a new dimension to the stability of free political systems that I don't think that economists have paid enough attention to. And so you ask the question, and the truth is I don't actually have an answer to it because I only myself see the contours of the question because I wrote the book. But I think figuring out the answer to that question is going to be the major theme in American public life for the next 10 to 20 years.
Well, to all of our students, go put on go open the books and start studying. Hopefully one of you can answer the question. But
dissertations need to be written. Have at it.
Exactly. There you go. But Dr. Salter, this was a great interview. Thanks so much for joining us. If people want to follow more of your work, where should they look?
I keep all of my writings at my personal website, which is www.awsalter.com. I was going to say I'm usually off social media. I'm on Facebook a little bit. I don't have a Twitter handle. So chances are the best way to find me is my website. If you're on Facebook, send me a friend request. I accept most of them. And of course, if you want to just chat over email, I'm always happy to exchange messages with listeners and readers. I love talking about people with this stuff. It's why I got into this business in the first place. So please, I'd love to hear from you.
Excellent. And the book is The Political Economy of Distributism. We will link it in the show notes. It will be out by the time the podcast is released. But so thank you again. And thank you to our listeners for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to go to isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.